Welcome to Flip Class History. I'm Janet Comer.
And I'm Ashley Glaze.
Ashley, when you hear the term scientific revolution, what comes to your mind?
Radical change.
Radical change. That's very good. And you know, the scientific revolution is going to be a radical change in science. In fact, if it hadn't been for the scientific revolution, we wouldn't even be here today recording our lesson today for the class.
Really? So, that means that there's no cell phone, no electricity. Am I having to
No
actually
computers.
cook my own food, like on wood?
You're probably going out and killing the meat
I
and
am not.
everything
No,
too.
my chicken comes from the fridge.
That's where mine comes too. I understand that. Well, back in the Dark Ages, people looked for two things for knowledge. They went for the Bible. They also are going to look really at magic. They didn't really understand how all that worked, and they just assumed it was magic. And so sometimes they would combine the two together. And so when people like Prince Henry the Navigator is opening up his school and teaching people to build ships and how to study the stars, you know, because when you're out in the water and you don't have any land around, you need to have something to guide you. So they began looking at the stars and trying to determine the layout of the stars, and today we would call that what?
Astronomy.
Very good. Well, back then there was a very fine line between astronomy and astrology. And so you had this guy by the name of Ptolemy back in the 2nd century who had given us the idea of the Earth-centered universe. Do you know what that's called?
Earth-centered. Geocentric?
That is awesome. Geocentric.
Now, I do have a quick question.
Yes.
Is this astronomy or astrology from back then?
Well, this was astronomy.
So, for clarification purposes,
Mm-hmm.
when we're talking about the geocentric and the stars, are we talking about the stars that are guiding our lives?
Well, that's a good question. Let's just kind of compare that. Astronomy is part of the physical universe that actually guide us, and it will guide the ships when they're out exploring.
And astrology is the flip side of that, guiding our emotional lives.
Correct. Very good. Ptolemy was the one who came up with the idea of the geocentric view. And so it was the idea that God has a specific location. And so, you know, you always think about it. Where do you look when you go to pray to God?
Up.
And you ever wondered why people look up when they pray to God?
No. Why do we?
Well, I think it probably comes from this time period here when people begin saying, well, God has a place in the heavens, and the heavens are up there above the stars. And so people would look up toward the heavens.
They make sense. Giving him a physical location, looking up to that physical location. I could see that.
Well, Copernicus comes up with this theory that it's not really the Earth that's the center of the universe, it's really the sun. And so it's going to be called the heliocentric view, after the sun and being the gases. He doesn't really have proof to support it, and so he needs some more people to come in to support that. Well, Johann Kepler put some meat behind Copernicus' theory, his idea, and so he's going to track the stars, and he's going to determine that they actually do not go in a circular motion, but more in an elliptical pattern. And then Galileo comes in and he tracks it with a telescope, and so he is making observations as well. And so he goes back and he confirms Copernicus' idea that it's not the Earth that is the center, but yet the sun. And so eventually he takes it to the Catholic Church and lets them in on what his discovery is, and they do not take very kindly to this at all.
So just to recap, we have the geocentric model, which says that we are Earth-centered and it has a physical location of the heavens.
Right.
Then we have the heliocentric model, which says it's sun-centered and it takes out that physical location of the heavens.
Right.
Is that why the Catholic Church is so upset about this?
You hit it right on the head. And so they were very upset. They said, you have taken God out of the equation. Where is God at? And he's like, well, you know, God's all around us. They said, well, you know, God was in the heavens, but now where are you saying heaven is? And so that really upset the church. They told Galileo that he needed to take back his words. And you know what? He does. He takes it back.
Oh. He does all this work and then he takes back everything?
That's unbelievable, isn't it? I mean, Martin Luther, remember when we talked about him? He refused to recant and refused to back down. Galileo, I guess, you know, a little bit different kind of guy perhaps, and he refuses to do that. And in fact, he takes it all back, and he ends up living under house arrest for the rest of his days.
It's a hard decision to make.
It is.
So you mentioned earlier about how it was a combination of the Bible and magic. Now, did this actually kind of start the witchcraft trials?
You know, it's interesting that you mentioned that. There was this guy named Newton. You remember anything about Newton?
Well, I remember apples.
Okay, and the gravitational and the 3 laws of motion and all that. Would you believe it? His mother had been accused of witchcraft. She had had an argument with somebody, and she had given them something to drink that made them sick. And so they claimed that she had given them a potion and that she was a witch. And so she was actually thrown into jail as a witch.
You know what? I heard that happen pretty often, especially to women who were single or widowed or just old in the neighborhood. You know, they knew a lot about the herbs and things that could help people.
That's true.
And I bet that was Newton's mom.
I bet so too. And so Newton had to go about and prove that she indeed was not a witch. And so he's going to use a lot of his science discoveries to prove that she was not a witch.
Are there any significant ones that come out of this?
Well, he came up with the 3 laws of motion, and he's going to also determine, the gravitational pull. So, when we jump, we don't just float away, we actually come back down. So he's going to determine that as well. I guess that's why you remember the apple falling on your head
The
kind of
apple.
thing.
Mm-hmm.
And he's going to write a book called The Principia that explains his 3 laws in the book. So he is combining his knowledge of math and science, and he's even using it to get his mother out of jail as well.
Very practical application. I like it.
Yes. Well, actually, we've talked so far about how astronomy was affected by the science revolution. Now we're going to talk about the body. There was this guy named Galen who had done he'd cut up animals and things. I think he cut pigs and things up just to try to see what the anatomy of the animal was like. And he assumed that the animal's anatomy would be the same as a human's anatomy.
Oh, no.
They even thought at some point that it was the liver that gave us life.
Well, you know what? This reminds me of a movie clip.
Okay.
So have you ever seen The Little Mermaid?
No, I haven't. I've got boys, I'm sorry.
Oh, my goodness. Well, I don't have any kids, but I have seen The Little Mermaid.
Okay, well, do tell me the story.
And there's this bird in there. He's called Scuttle, and he's knowledgeable on all things human.
Mm-hmm.
And so when Ariel gets washed up, he puts her foot to his ear to check for a heartbeat. And he's just like, oh, she's dead, kaplunk. But she wasn't actually dead. That's what this reminds me of.
So, kind of the same thing then with the liver and the heart and all that.
Mm-hmm. Now, after talking about The Little Mermaid, I do have one other question. Why didn't he just open up a real human body instead of the animals?
It was against the Catholic Church, and so you were not allowed to do that. And so they didn't really know how the blood flowed or anything like that. And so this guy named Vesalius, he says, well, I know the Catholic Church is not in favor of this, but he goes to the graveyard and he digs up cadavers, criminals, and he digs them up and brings their bodies back, and he lays them out on his table, and he cuts them open so that he could determine the real anatomy of the humans.
Well, that's beneficial to us, but I've got to say that's also very creepy.
It is creepy. And so when friends come over, I imagine he has to hide his body somewhere, and so maybe this is where...
Body parts in the fridge.
Ooh, that's gross. I'm thinking more like the closet. He hides the skeleton in the closet kind of thing,
But that's right.
Although the smell
Oh.
has to be horrid.
Yeah, but they didn't have air fresheners.
Ever gone to those science labs and thought, oh my word.
Yeah, I have seen Silence of the Lambs, and I have seen where they have to put stuff underneath their nose because the smell of a rotting corpse is horrid.
So I can't imagine. If he lived in an apartment building, everybody would be throwing him out.
Yes.
Well, he discovers that the anatomy is completely different than that of a human being. But it's still going to be some time later until they're able to find out how the blood flows, because obviously a dead person doesn't have blood that's going to flow. And so...
Now, I'm having a critical thinking moment here, just to insert. So what I'm hearing is that with the stars and with the body, and I'm sure with the other things we're going to discuss, the Catholic Church was very against this because it went against what they had been teaching. Is it just because of what they had been teaching, or is it because it's challenging their authority?
I think it's probably because it's challenging their authority, because what we learned about in the Protestant Reformation, that they did not like to be challenged on things.
And so this is just a continuation of what we have been talking about.
You're right. That's a good connection on there. That's good. So we've talked a little bit about the heart and how we do know that the heart is what gives us life. Now I guess back in the Dark Ages at some point, I know they used to put leeches on people and try to bleed them out when they were sick. Do you know anything about that?
I do, actually. So they would put a needle in your arm, they'd put a bowl underneath here, and they would try to bleed out as much blood as possible to get rid of infection, because they thought the only way to have infection was in the blood. So if they got rid of enough blood, they could get rid of the infection. Unfortunately, if you also get rid of enough blood, you die anyway.
Now this is back when they thought that you actually had two kinds of blood, right?
Yes. And this is also the time period where we get the idea of blue blood, because if you look at your veins, you see blue.
Mm-hmm.
So we tend to think of rich people and the blue bloods, but that's actually where that term came from.
Well, that's interesting.
So who actually did figure out that we just have one blood system?
That was William Harvey. Harvey Hart is what I call him. So he's the one who realizes it's not the liver that gives us life, it's the heart that gives us life.
And that it's just one set of blood circling all through us.
Correct.
I like it. Go William.
So we're getting more advanced in medicine as we are progressing in the scientific revolution.
Yes, very good. So if we're doing all of this, where do we start coming up with the idea that we need to scrub?
That is going to come from Louis Pasteur. Now he does an experiment where he takes meat and he leaves some of the meat out that's not covered, and he takes another piece of meat and then he covers it up with probably like something like we would call cellophane wrap or something similar back in the day to that. And he finds out that when he comes back that the meat that has rotted has got flies all over it. And so, flies have come in, they've laid their eggs there, and now they're just crawling all over it. It had to be a gross scene, yes. But the meat that was wrapped up, the flies couldn't come in, they couldn't lay their eggs there, and so it did not have any flies on it, so it was clean. They began to kind of compare, and he did lots of other experiments. He did things with milk as well. And finally they realized, that we have germs. We can't see them, but they're there, and that's why we have to wash our hands, especially during cold and flu seasoning and all the sneezing we've got going on in the classroom.
I bet that this washing our hand theory is why our life expectancy extended.
I bet so, because we only lived for a while, maybe 35, and I've long beat that.
I haven't hit whatever yet.
I have, and I intend to keep right on tracking. So far we've talked about how the scientific revolution affected astronomy, how it affected the body, and now we're going to look at chemistry.
Oh, I made a C in chemistry.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Well, Robert Boyle is going to introduce us into learning about the gases. And so we look at the different states of the gases. You have the liquid, the solid, and the gas. And so he's going to be doing a lot of experiments with that kind of thing.
Actually, I kind of remember him and about the pressure exerted on gas.
Yes.
It reminds me of like the balloon where you fill it up, and if you squish it down so far, it goes kaput.
And pops.
Yes.
So you're right. So without him, we wouldn't have the scientific to back up what you just said about the balloon. So the next guy with chemistry is Lavoisier, Antoine Lavoisier. And he does a lot of things with chemistry, and so he is the one who comes up with the periodic table.
Do you know what I remember about the periodic table?
What?
That my initials stand for silver.
Well, you're right. They do.
That's how I remembered that one element on a test.
But now you have to memorize the rest of them.
Oh, my good. I'm out of chemistry. That's why I teach world history.
Okay, I see. I got you. All right. Well, the last thing I want to talk about would be some of the women who were into science as well. We've looked at how women's education was a lot different back then. And so a lot of times when they did things that were notable, they didn't really get the notability on that. But there are two ladies I want to look at today. The first one is Margaret Cavendish, and so she was very notable in the science field and recognized as such. And the other one I want to talk about is Maria Winkelmann. Now she is going to discover a comet, And she is married, and she's a scientist, and her husband was a scientist too. The story goes is that her husband was asleep, or he would have discovered it, but she found it, and so she went and came and told him and woke him up. And so he actually gives her credit for finding or seeing and discovering that comet.
Well, good for him. I mean, I like how it's a little bit sly in there, you know, if I had been awake.
Well,
but
true.
at least he recognizes it and admits it. That's a step in the right direction.
That's true. Well, I think that's probably a wrap for today for the scientific revolution. Again, it addresses 4 places: astronomy, the body, the chemistry, and some women actually got noticed in the process.